This is Barrack. He's traditionally a point tank. And this is Raum. He's traditionally an off tank. But what does that actually mean? Point tanks generally have the best sustain, whether through shield, self-healing or damage reduction. This allows them to expose themselves more to enemy fire, but it doesn't make them invulnerable, and it definitely doesn't mean they should just be stood in the middle of the map. Off tanks generally put out more damage than point tanks, usually at the expense of sustain, and are generally more manoeuvrable. They may also have area denial tools, like Ash's knockback or Makoa's hook. But Dumkey, you say to yourself in my head. Barrack is very manoeuvrable with his rocket boots, and can put out a lot of damage with his turrets up, and Raum has soul armour, as well as cards that heal him and a talent to reduce his damage while dashing. And you're right, they aren't clear categories, but rather a spectrum from the most point tank-like, probably Inara, to the most off-tank-like, maybe Ruckus? So when you've got two tanks, and in the current patch you almost always should, work out which is the most pointy and which is the most offy, and fulfill those roles. How do you fulfill those roles? Let's go to Stonekeep to see. Stonekeep is made of 3 lanes. For our team, mid goes up the centre, stairs is currently on the left, and cathedral is on the right. Obviously, mid is exposed in all directions, so it's harder to survive there, but you need to be there to capture the point and win the game. So in the initial team fight, does Barrack go to point and Raum take whichever side he's feeling? Well, sometimes. In order to know what your tanks need to do, you need to know your win condition, and to work that out you need to look at your lineups. Generally, one team is passive and the other is aggressive. That's a video in its own right, but generally the passive team has better damage at long range, more shielding, more damage reduction and more healing. This team can afford to play defensively, try to keep the enemy at range, while the aggressive team tries to close the distance without getting killed in order to force the enemy back and create space around the point. In these videos, blue team's tanks, Inara and Raum, are representing the passive team, while red team's tanks, Barrack and Torvald, are the aggressive team. This is all a bit contrived as I couldn't get 10 people to do what I want, so you have to imagine the supports and damages. So here's some broad illustrations to get you started. If you're the point tank for the passive team, you can probably go straight to point. But if you're the point tank for the aggressive team and you go straight to point, you're going to get killed. So you need to attack in an off lane to create the space for your team to get close to the enemy backline. In the case of Stonekeep, this is usually stairs side, because it provides better cover for approaching the enemy backline. But if that's too difficult to break through, you might need to go through Cathedral instead. And who's making it difficult to get through? The passive team's off tank is, often with an off support or one of the team's damage dealers. Note that they don't need to get any kills. If their team are capping, then they're happy with the status quo, and just delaying the enemy is sufficient. It's generally the aggressive team's job to make something happen. That just leaves the aggressive off tank, who has 2 options. If the passive team can't punish grouping up, then you can stack with the point tank, as has been done here, to push through quicker. But if you all end up running into a firebomb in a narrow corridor, that's going to suck. Most teams should have some way to punish grouping up, in which case you take whichever off lane the point tank doesn't and try to get into the enemy backline by a different route, in this case using Cathedral as the main tank goes stairs. There are 2 possible outcomes from here. If the passive team hold off the aggressive team long enough, they cap, and you move on to the pushing phase. If the aggressive team break through, then the point tank for the passive team needs to retreat to protect the backline. This creates space on the point so that the aggressive team can start to cap. Normally, the aggressive point tank will be beyond the objective at this stage, so it's for a backline damage or healer to cap so the point tank can hold the space that you've taken. This is obviously super simplified, and there are 1,000 variations of this in real games. I can't cover them all, but the most common is all or most of a team going straight to point. If you're up against this as the aggressive team, then you should be able to get into their backline for free, kill the support and damage, and then kill the point tank 5v1. If you're the passive team, you should be able to meet them head on with your greater sustain and burn them down before pushing on to take further space. The other common issue is you're the point tank, but the off tank is standing on point. Assuming the opposition are playing as above, then you can try to politely explain what you want them to do, or, more likely, you can act as the off tank, so at least the jobs are being done, even if not by the ideal people. So you've successfully capped. Now what? Now you need to create the space to push. For the main tank, this normally means controlling the mid lane, where the payload is going to go. On Stone Keep, you can afford to be ahead of the payload once the enemy team has been pushed back, usually with the support pushing the actual payload, as there's a reasonable amount of cover available and limited sight lines. For the off tank, you need to force the enemy away from wherever they can most effectively attack the payload. In the early stages, this is beyond stairs, later on it's high ground. Both the point and off tank should be trying to take as much space as possible. Sometimes this means standing on the point if that's where the enemy is. Point tank only, obviously. And sometimes this means aggressively zoning, i.e. spawn camping the enemy base. So what's the summary? Work out who is the point tank and who is the off tank for your team. Work out whether you're the aggressive or passive team. If you're the passive point tank, control the point, or the space beyond it if you can. If you're the passive off tank, guard your backline. If you're the aggressive point tank, try to get at the enemy backline. If you're the aggressive off tank, also try to get at the enemy backline, either with or separate to your point tank. Most importantly, adapt to your team. There's no point diving the enemy backline alone, and it's not worth trying to control the point if your backline is getting smashed, even if that's what I'm saying you should ideally be doing.